Well, it's been quite an interesting evening. We began the program with Arnie Gunderson, followed by David Bloom, and then Dr. John Apsley. And coming up is now Stephen Starr, who was on the program on the 23rd of March of this year to discuss, the same subject, and it's generally the proliferation of little things that generate ionizing radiation. We'll get Stephen Starr's take on Fukushima, maybe some things we can do to protect ourselves from it. But at this point, as we go on through the program, and then we just heard from Marty, which that was a fabulous call, Marty. Thank you very much. Wish we'd have a little bit more time for the top of the hour so you could talk some more. But you're a man of the seas, and he knows what he's talking about. So I think this is one of those disgusting sandwiches that whether we take a nibble or we take a big bite, we're all going to have some. So let's get Stephen Starr's take on the ramifications from the disaster at Fukushima, and see if we can divine a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. Right? I'm not going to use the train analogy. That's just too obvious even for me. All right, right back with Stephen Starr in just a moment. This is Coast to Coast AM. Stand by. Stephen Starr is also an expert on the environmental consequences of nuclear war, and in 2011 he made an address to the UN General Assembly describing the dangers that nuclear weapons and nuclear war poses to all nations and peoples. He's made presentations to ministry officials, parliamentarians, universities, citizens, and students from around the world, and specializes in making technical scientific information understandable to all audiences. Welcome back to the program, Stephen Starr. It's been a while. How you doing?
Oh, fine, thanks, John. It's a pleasure to be back with you.
Well, it's really good to have you. And I realize that you're not a nuclear accident investigator, but I know you have some opinions and maybe some really good intel on this Fukushima thing. I mean, the reports that we see from various alternative news sources, since they're virtually non-existent in mainstream media, I mean, they're just all over the place. People are saying things like they're calling for testing, but there's nothing really stated as to whether or not testing is being done. And I'm just wondering what your take on all of this is.
Well, I appreciate you having some experts on the show like Arnie Gunderson to talk about this, because you're right. Voices like that aren't heard in the corporate media. And it's a shame. I think it's a modern form of censorship, really. It's by omission. I started talking about this when I first my first take on this is when I heard about the accident and I look at the power plant there at Fukushima. I was horrified that anybody could be crazy enough to put not only on the coast by where a tsunami could hit, but if you look how close those reactors are to each other. I mean, they're right on top of each other. And when you think about how much radiation is in those reactors and the spent fuel pools, just a serious accident at one could make the rest of the site unapproachable, because it's we're still looking at that. So I can elaborate on some worst case scenarios for you if you'd like me to do that.
Sure, why not?
Well, I know we've heard it a little bit already. There's a Japanese diplomat named Akio Matsumura, and I started a conversation with him and Arnie Gunderson and Bob Alvarez, or I got in on it shortly after the accident occurred. And, my worst-case scenario is that the spent fuel pool in reactor building number 4 would collapse. And Arnie Gunderson and Bob Alvarez has told me that if that's the case, then the gamma radiation that would be coming from a collapsed pool, and it's super hot in reactor building number 4 because they offloaded the entire contents of the core a couple months before the accident or the disaster took place. And so that would, according to Bob and Arnie, there would be enough gamma radiation coming out of that you just literally, you couldn't get close to it. You can't put on a suit of lead or anything. It would kill you if you got within 300 or 500 feet of it. And then the hell of it is there's a common fuel pool where they've stored older spent fuel rods, quite a few of them. It's about, something like 100 feet away from reactor building number 4. So that nobody would be able to access that. And even though it's older, it's still, all these things have to have big cooling systems because the rods continue to generate a lot of heat. just for a long time. It depends on the type of fuel, but quite a few years. So if that would boil off because nobody could get to it, then you could have another, even a bigger radioactive release. The rods don't necessarily have to burn. They can rupture. And cesium-137 is the key element that we've seen in a Chernobyl accident and at Fukushima. And it's released in large quantities because it's in the spent fuel, and it's a metal that it becomes a liquid at 82 degrees Fahrenheit. So when the rods rupture at about 1,700 degrees, most of that's already made into a gas, and so it gets out. So then, I mean, basically, at some point, you wouldn't be able to get to any of the reactors there. So that's when you, well, I'm sure by then you'd want to have evacuated Tokyo, but I don't know what would happen to Japan at that point. So that was my nightmare scenario I was trying to communicate early on to Bob and Arnie, and I'm not exactly sure. Nobody really knows what would happen, but I think there's a potential for that.
A fellow named Bill sent an email a while ago and says most of us expats are lifers here in Tokyo, and even though we know it's bad, what can we do? It's not like we can just pack up and leave and go back home after decades of living here. But that quake woke us up at 7:40 a.m., the 5.5. And, that area, that whole area just rattles all the time. The vast majority of them are small.
Well, TEPCO is like the Three Stooges running the, one of the things they've done that hasn't been in the news, there's 300 to 600 tons of water that's going around the molten corium and becoming highly irradiated and going out into the ocean. And so they were aware of that, so they built a wall in between the reactors and the ocean, an underground wall. They used chemicals to do it. So it hardened the soil to a depth. It stopped. The wall stopped about 5 feet from the surface. Well, it's kind of like if you put a plug in your bathtub and turn on the water, what do you think is going to happen eventually?
Right.
The water built up behind the wall, and now it's going over the wall, and it's actually they've dug some pools there where you can see the groundwater at surface level. Now, I haven't been able to ascertain exactly what the foundation is of all the reactor buildings, but it's quite clear that they've more or less liquefied the subsoil around that whole area around the reactor. So that increases the chances of collapsing the buildings if there's another large quake. So that's just one of the, how could somebody be so stupid to do that? But it's just like Arnie Gunderson said earlier in your show, these guys run a utility. They're not an engineering company. They have no business trying to do this project.
And he said that basically the world is trying to help them, but they're practically being turned down, and they're talking about building ice walls and stuff. Right. I mean, some of this stuff is as genius as like putting a toilet in the swimming pool, actually in the swimming pool.
Well, early on it was clear the nuclear industry is the last thing they wanted to have happen. And, a lot of the American, if you're going to build a reactor in the United States, you're going to get a lot of components from Japan. So they were trying to figure out how to shut this thing up right off the bat. And that's part of the problem now. The media has said, if you remember, they announced there was a cold shutdown, although I'm not quite sure how cold it is with molten corium underneath the ground. But
right.
that was the news, and then they stopped talking about it. And then you'll hear blurbs on national propaganda radio and some of the places like that where they, they make up phony stories about, they try to frame this as being, well, there's a bit of a problem, but the real nuclear guys like to talk about how the tsunami was what really hurt everything, and this is just overblown. So it's very frustrating to me, but I think that's a big part. My point is that the media blackout has really made it harder to have an international intervention in this.
Well, it makes me suspicious that perhaps since it's known that mainstream media outlets, some of them are paid to run certain stories, and they're paid not to run certain stories. I wonder if they're being paid not to run this story because, it's obvious that this is a problem. It's obvious that, I've mentioned this about the third time. There's, this island of rubbish that's 3 times the size of Britain, and it's just floating right toward California,
Let me tell you another story that you've never heard on the radio or the TV, I would think. And it's about what happens if North Korea drops a ballistic missile on a reactor in South Korea or Japan. And more importantly, on a spent fuel pool, because I'd like to talk about those in the U.S. eventually, but the spent fuel pools have been building up nuclear waste for decades, and there's usually, in the U.S., for example, there's 5 times more radioactivity in the spent pools than there is in the reactor core. And this is more or less, it's not quite that bad in Japan and South Korea, but it's, close. And, we're worried about an earthquake, but, all those reactors are, and South Korea's done the same thing. They have sets of, a couple big plants with 6 reactors right next to each other and a couple more with 4. Well, what happens if you drop a bomb on one of those things? Nobody ever talks about that. I mean, North Korea doesn't have to have a nuclear weapon. All they have to do is drop some conventional warheads on a power plant. They can make Japan and South Korea uninhabitable. There was an English lord that said, if there were nuclear reactors in Europe before World War II, nobody would be living there right now. So that's another big issue I have with nuclear power. They like to figure all the probabilities of earthquakes and stuff, but even the Nuclear Regulatory Commission doesn't like to talk about terrorist acts that spent fuel pools here.
Do you talk to any of the people actually living in Japan? Do you ever have an opportunity to do that?
Well, I have corresponded with a few people, and it's sad. There's a lady that's a journalist, and she wrote to me about she was in Tokyo, and both she and her child have had a lot of problems. And when I did a presentation at New York Academy of Medicine, Helen Caldecott had a symposium there. I did some research, and I found these diagrams on the internet that I don't know if they really meant for them to get out, but it was from the Lawrence Livermore labs, and it showed the radiation plume going directly over Tokyo on March 14th, about 2100 hours, and Tokyo got hit with radiation. It wasn't really raining there. The fallout patterns the contamination patterns are a lot of times a function of whether it was rained out or not. That's where you see it's always patchy. But, Arnie Gunderson mentioned earlier that there's, he took those soil samples in Tokyo, and it's all would be nuclear waste in the U.S., and when at the symposium, he mentioned that the air in the prefecture, that's like the state there, to be a state in the United States, the whole area there where Tokyo is, had huge levels of radioactive noble gases, xenon, for almost a week. And they didn't warn anybody. I mean, to me, that's like an attack with a biological weapon of mass destruction. They should have had people indoors with the, windows shut and not running, ventilation systems, but instead everybody walked around it. So the lady that I spoke with that wrote to me, they've been having ongoing health problems from that. It wasn't acute enough radiation sickness that you'd see like after the bomb drop in Hiroshima, where people would, were dying and bleeding out and hair falling out, and but there's illness, and I think so. It's just a terrible thing that's happened over there.
Yeah, the BBC has this report that says the dead zone, the real dead zone at Fukushima monitor went off scale over 180,000 CPM. Experts shook their head when asked where the melted fuel is. TEPCO says, don't ask what we'll do with reactors 1, 2, and 3. And then CNN says TEPCO only wanted to show us reactor 4. Strict rules about what we could film.
Yeah, and they want to show you a film reel from 4 years ago, probably. Show you what progress are. I don't know. It's just I can't believe anything they said. TEPCO, for the first 2 months, if you remember, they said, well, we're trying to prevent a meltdown. And they knew damn well it melted down in the first day or two. They tracked the radiation over Japan, and they didn't even warn their own people. They prevented the distribution of potassium iodide tablets. How many cases of thyroid cancer is that going to cause? I kind of get worked up about it. I admit it, but it's really. I thought the Russians were bad after Chernobyl, but it's the same pattern. The Soviet Union made it illegal for a physician to diagnose radiation-related illnesses, and then in Belarus. I spent almost a year overseeing, a translation of a study by a pathologist named Yuri Banichevsky in Belarus. He was the head of the State Medical Institute, and they spent 9 years working on this. They examined over 100,000 children. They did over 400 autopsies, mostly on children that had, and infants that had lived and died in the contaminated regions, because Belarus, 23% of the country was covered with fallout from the Chernobyl disaster. And they found that, and they did 3,000 to 5,000 human tissue samples, and they found that the cesium-137 bioconcentrates, it accumulates in certain tissues, not uniformly distributed. Like if you go to the EPA website here in the United States, it says Cesium-137 is uniformly distributed in the tissues in the body. Well, they found that it's highly concentrated in endocrine tissues and heart, kidneys, pancreas, and they correlated that with, big increases in insulin-dependent diabetes and heart disease. They call it Chernobyl heart. And so the reward for Baniszewski was that when he went and gave the presentation to the parliament, went home, soldiers came to his house and arrested him, threw him into prison. They went to the State Medical Institute and destroyed all of his slides and samples from 9 years' worth of research. So that's part of the reason we never heard about that. I talk maybe too much at length, but the point about this is that we have to be worried about cesium getting into the ecosystems. That's what they're talking about the plume coming across their modeling, coming across the Pacific. It's cesium-137 because it's water soluble, it mimics potassium, and it bioaccumulates. Bioaccumulation is when something builds up in an individual organism faster than it can excrete it. And biomagnification is when a bigger organism eats that and it gets progressively more concentrated. We've seen that with DDT where it'll be 10 million times more concentrated in an eagle's eggshell than it would be in the water. So that's what I worry about, with the Pacific. And the same thing happens in any ecosystems where the stuff gets into the soil, so all the food stuffs become contaminated. So I think I sent you, I don't know if you got to see it or not, but earlier this evening, I sent you a study that was done, and it's a good study. And they're predicting that off the Hawaiian coast and northwestern American coast, there's going to be 410 atomic disintegrations per cubic meter of water later first part of next year. And it's going to be the next year after that, it's going to get the, California coast, and it's going to be 10 to 20 atomic disintegrations per second per cubic meter of water for at least, 6 or 7 years. So we're looking at, the whole Pacific's full of this stuff, and we have no idea how it's going to build up. It's a gigantic experiment. What's going to happen?
Isn't it amazing how many people are actually in denial about this? As a matter of fact, I'd just like to pop off for a second if you'll indulge me, sir.
Sure. You'll indulge me. I haven't talked.
No. Listen, you're the guest. I'm just, I just steer. You tell us where you want to go. But it's amazing how cynical people are. Some people are. That element is always going to be among us, and those as well who are in just outright denial. It's like, hey, Wells, why don't you try playing it straight instead of scaring ignorant, uninformed masses? It's like, are you able to read the words on the email you just typed out? It's like ignorance just means you don't know. Stupid that's an entirely different matter. I'm looking at an ABC Los Angeles news report right now from November 7. That's day before yesterday, and this is what it says. Expert confirms radioactive water on way to West Coast and arriving in the next few months. Will we really be told if it's dangerous? Journalist in Japan. Lethal contamination is gushing out, endangering millions and wreaking havoc on ocean. So, let me just state for the record, I don't know of anybody else who put a site together. I make my dough doing other stuff. I'm involved in a lot of other projects. I don't even have a book yet, okay? So I don't know of anybody else on any radio, or let alone a television program, who's saying, look, I don't really care where you get this equipment. I made the equipment available. Get some if you want, and if you don't, that's okay too. But get it from somewhere, because this is a problem, and it's not going away. So anyway, that's my little pop-off for the moment, and we'll be right back with Stephen Starr. You want to take a few calls later, Stephen?
Sure.
All right, we'll take a couple. If you know the numbers, go ahead and ring them up. But, when you get on the air, we'd like to give you a minute, but just about a minute. And if you've got a question for Stephen Starr, and because of Fukushima, of course, we're not really talking about dirty bombs. We're not really talking about terrorist bombs. We're not really talking about... Notice how North Korea just dropped off the scope. I wonder who told them to drop off the scope. We blow up Austin, Texas. We blow up... we just throw a dart at the map and blow something up, right? We're not talking about the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and now Iran is... Well, it appears they've joined the club. So... As long as we're talking about a few melted down reactors, why don't we talk about the possibility that the world may go all the rest of the way insane and start threatening each other with some of those glow green in the dark weapons that they are just obsessed with possessing, because that makes them special when they join the nuclear club, don't you know? Yeah, they're special, all right. This is Coast to Coast AM, back with Stephen Starr in just a moment. Jimmy Dewar on the vocal and Robin Trower on the guitar. Fabulous guitar player. You should take a spin by the coasttocoastam.com website. You know, once a day anyway. A lot of good stuff in the news. Get this. Motorola wants to patent a neck tattoo that doubles as a, yes, microphone. Strongest solar flare of 2013 erupts from sun. That's from space.com. And yes, Lady Gaga to perform Song from Space. I think that's entirely appropriate. All right. A few more of your calls tonight. Thanks for being with us. It's look, this is serious stuff. I know that people you get bombarded with news all the time. It's like, oh God, the healthcare thing. Oh God, the environment, global warming. You know, again, like Bill Murray said, dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria. But you know what? It just seems like more of a. It really seems like more of a mission than anything else. Because, frankly, after coming to work on this program and being with you for these almost 2 years now on Saturday nights, it just annoys me to see what the public at large is being fed from most of the mainstream media. It's just amazing. We know that you are, and I say you, we. Let's say we. I'm one of you. We're not stupid. We can take it. We're not going to flip out and go crazy because we get a little shot of bad news. We've never done that before. We're not going to do it now. You know, sorry if it looks like maybe nuclear power ought to be looked at here in this country because, you know, the waste is piling up. Sites where accidents have happened are still hot. And now this thing in Japan, and it's unbelievable. This lady, Susie Taylor for Ms. Magazine, November 5th. Yes, Guy Fawkes Day, 2013. She says that she was assigned originally to produce a video for Time with her partner, but she couldn't focus on her work. Tears surfaced as she thought of the deserted towns we passed. She says, then I looked out to sea. Somewhere beneath the shoreline, lethal radioactive water was gushing outward. So, look, here's the thing. Some may have finished school, and you're going to have to go back. Some have not had much formal school, and you're going to have to get into it. It doesn't mean you have to attend classes at a campus. But what is incumbent upon us now, all of us, is to read and gather information and prepare yourself and prepare an escape route by way of a solution to these problems that are confronting us for future generations. It's not all just about us. It's about those who will follow us as we make our way through the 21st century and hopefully beyond. Looks a little thin from time to time, but we are humans, and humans are pretty resilient. So, you know, accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, and don't mess with Mr. In-Between, as the old song goes. We'll be back with Stephen Starr in just a moment. This is Coast to Coast AM. All right, Stephen Starr is our guest right at the moment here. He's been on with us before, back on the 23rd of March. His website is nucleardarkness.org and psr.org. That's Physicians for Social Responsibility, psr.org. Stephen, this is a great email. This is like listening to one of those middle of the night pill pushers. Worrying about your health is bad for your health. You can turn your food into poison by thinking about it too much. I recommend an all Marie Callender diet. Just flop that turkey pot pie over a few steamed Brussels sprouts. You're good to go. Little dab of cranberry sauce on the side is nice. Worried about the salmon? No problem. $20 a pound will keep you from eating too much of that. I live at a salmon fishing port, and I can't afford the stuff. Steamed vegetables and Marie Callender, you'll be fine. Thanks, Luther. Yeah, I'll take a pot pie right now.
I'm going to get one since we're up the air.
Yeah, right. I'll tell you what. You want to gain 5 pounds quick? I can tell you how to do it.
You know, if you don't mind, I wanted to make sure I included a solution here so we don't have an American Fukushima one of these days, because we're heading for that.
Please.
First, I want people to understand how toxic this stuff is. The cesium-137 that we're talking about coming across the Pacific, there's a lot more of it made in nuclear power plants than there were in nuclear bombs. For example, in one spent fuel pool, typical one in the United States, there's 3 to 4 times more cesium-137 than was released by all the atmospheric nuclear weapons tests combined. So that's the scale, and so every single power plant, we have 104 power plants here in the U.S. They've been piling up their waste on site since they've been operating, because we don't have any place to take it. And the reactors, the utilities are cheap, so their solution to this was just put more and more of it into, they call it a spent fuel pool. It's like a tennis court-sized swimming pool. It's next to the reactor, but it's outside of the primary containment. They thought, initially they thought, well, we're going to have this stuff out here. It has to be underwater for about 5 years because it'll kill anybody and it'll burn if it makes contact with air. So it's transferred underwater to the spent fuel pool. But at that point, they expected to take it to long-term underground storage someplace, which there is none here in the U.S. So there's more and more and more. So every spent fuel pond in the U.S. has at least 5 times more radioactivity in it than's in the reactor. And the spent fuel pools are outside of the primary containment, and some of them are just, some of them are. There's 23 reactors like the ones at Fukushima that are the top of it 7 stories above ground. So here's what we need to do: we need to get the old fuel rods out of there, because the way this stuff works is the ones that come out of the reactor are so hot that they will burn at about 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's like a fire. If you put pile up a lot of wood on a fire, it'll get bigger and bigger. And leaving the old fuel rods in the fuel ponds is exactly that. It's particularly, they call it high density. That they've increased the density of these rods in the ponds to where it's insane. The one here in Missouri, for example, was designed to hold 350 fuel assemblies. Now it has about 1,700. They're going to put about 2,400 in it. So it's just like a gigantic radiological weapon that's pre-positioned, ready to, and all you have to do is let the water out of the pool, and the rods will rupture and burn. And the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has estimated that 30% of the radiation could easily be released in a fuel fire. And now here's the part about the toxicity. When I was looking at the map of the exclusion zone around Chernobyl, and for people that don't know, there's about 1,100 square miles around the destroyed Chernobyl reactor that's uninhabitable because of the cesium-137 that's in the soil there. And they measure that in terms of curies, but I'm going to make it in terms of a weight so people could understand. So I was looking at it. 1 gram of cesium-137 has enough radiation in it, slightly more than 1 gram, to make a square mile uninhabitable for a couple centuries. So the map at Chernobyl shows it's per square kilometer. That's about a third of a gram. There's 104 curies per square mile, and that translates into 1.2 grams. Now, American dime weighs 2.7 grams, so less than half the weight of an American dime can make a square mile uninhabitable. If you take a 1.2 grams of cesium-137 and you burn it and make it into an aerosol or a smoke and distribute it evenly over that area. So, I mean, that's pretty hard to believe, isn't it? Like half the weight of a dime for a square mile. So then just remember now that there's over 1 million grams of cesium-137 in most of the spent fuel ponds in the U.S. So that gives you the idea of how toxic it's an enormous toxicological problem that's just waiting to go off. So we got to get this stuff. The way to minimize the danger is to get the old rods out, and they put it in what they call a dry cast storage. And it's hardened dry cast. You want to put this in a container that's underground in a bermed with a big concrete bunker around it. And they want to transport the stuff on the highways. I don't recommend it. Just get it out of the pool and put it there, and then we'll try to figure out what to do next. But we can't leave it in these pools because really all you have to do to have a fuel fire is to get the water out of the pool, and it's crazy. So they got to have the giant cooling systems running 24/7. There's about 300,000 gallons of water in a pool, and there's so much heat generated by some of these rods that, like, for example, the Fermi reactor on Lake Michigan, they estimate that it would take 4 or 5 hours for that water to start to boil if the cooling system went off. So they call it a boil down. If it boils long enough, there's a loss of off-site power. It'll boil down, and the rods can be exposed that way. So okay. So that's my information I wanted to get out here.
Well, good grief, and the thing is, you can dump all the concrete on it you want. That stuff will continue to burn, and really, it's already over in Japan. It's already burned through the ground. It's in the groundwater.
Right.
And I hate to say
so. I mean, it melts ceramic. It's 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit when that stuff starts melting and burning, and because of that, that's why so much cesium gets released, because that stuff becomes a gas that just maybe 500 or 600 degrees for sure. So it gets out and it rains out. Cesium's in the same atomic family as potassium, and it mimics it, and so it acts as a macronutrient in an ecosystem. And plants aren't used to discriminating because it's a rare element. It's a rare earth. There's only 3 parts per million in soil. So plants will reach down and they'll suck that stuff up, and they'll concentrate it, just like I was talking about earlier, and they recycle it in the ecosystem. So initially, the nuclear engineers who don't know much about any of this bioaccumulation or biomagnification just said, well, it'll be in the soil, but it'll sink down to the lower levels. It won't be a problem. Well, now they're finding it's quite a problem, and it's going to be around for centuries.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, Stephen, let's take a call from Alan. He's on Wild 3 out of Kauai. He's closest to the 3 times the size of Britain floating rubbish island. So let's talk to him for a second. Alan, what's going on?
Hey, how you doing? God bless both you guys. You're my heroes.
Well, right back at you. Thanks for calling.
I had a few questions. One is I have knowledge of Brown's gas, which is hydrogen gas, which has been electrolyzed from water. And back Yule Brown, who invented the gas, he was one of Tesla's buddies. And I saw a film where he was taking the flame from the hydrogen and melting radioactive material and hitting it with an aluminum rod, and it was erasing the radioactive footprint. And I also saw an MIT professor that was ranting about, why aren't we doing this? So that was my first question. Another is, do you think that if we channeled maybe the lava from a volcano into that mess, that it could possibly encase it? There's not many other things I've heard that we could do. So I know some of these guys in West Virginia, they got these good digging machines, and they can go into rock and everything. So, we could get a crew of those guys out there to help them out and do something like that.
Hey, thanks, Alan. Appreciate it. Stephen, that's the thing. It's almost like we're laughing about it because it's either
no. Well, I didn't mean to.
Or cry. No, we can laugh or we can cry. That's what I'm getting at. It's like, do you see if you could just rub the genie out of the lamp and just get all the resources and all the financing that you need to do this thing? Can you envisage anything that would actually cure this problem, even if you dump a bunch of lava on it? If it's gone China syndrome, it's in the groundwater. What are you going to do about that?
I think it's such a complex problem because they built the reactors there on an old riverbed, and there's a huge amount of groundwater that just goes through the site out into the ocean every day. So the fact that the corium, the melted core, has gone through not only the reactor vessel but the containment means that the groundwater is just circulating around it, and as it moves out into the ocean. So, but the thing is, it's so radioactive, like I was talking before, a spent fuel pool collapse, you can't get near it, it'll kill you. Well, the reactor core is not quite as bad as a pool because it doesn't, but it's close, and so they can't get close to that either. They can't, like even the reactor building, they can't even go in reactor number 3. So when it's unapproachable and it's below ground, it's just, that's why I was laughing. I'm thinking, man, I wish there was a solution. I don't know the Brown's gas question. I've read something about that, but I'm from Missouri, so it's the slogan here is "Show me," and if you can find something that can get rid of radioactivity, I'm all for it. And I think my belief is if something works, it'll be in use because there's plenty of radioactivity around the planet, and believe me, it's a very expensive thing to take care of. So, I do believe sometimes people seem to have a vested interest in, keeping horrible things going because they can make money. But It's more so in the case of a reactor because they make $1 to $2 million a day profit when it's running. So I can understand that motivation in terms of the. But I just when you think about the poisons that are being created, I try to explain how toxic cesium-137 is, and that's just one of the many poisons. The plutonium 239 lasts a half-life 24,000 years. So they, the U.S. is supposed to build a repository to store waste for 1 million years. Now, how in the hell are we going to do that? I mean, how can anybody guarantee you can isolate anything for 100,000 years? Neanderthals were walking around 35,000 years ago. So I'm just scratching my head about all this stuff. But when you have a really intractable problem, you just have to try to fix it one step at a time. And that's why I was talking about the spent fuel pools, because I see that as the most profound danger right now. Is we got to get the rods out of the pools, put them in dry cast storage, and then try to figure out what's next. But don't do it so you can keep the reactors going. That's the industry be like. They'd be glad to get funding to do this so they keep, because they're running out of room to put their waste. But we just don't need to make any more of this stuff. It's not worth it to boil water.
Yeah, didn't Einstein say it's a hell of a way to boil water? I think it was Einstein said it.
It really. Ask David Freeman. He came and spoke here at the university the other day, and he said he ran the Tennessee Valley Authority, and he said this really was this sort of an alternative form of energy when it came out, but we've got the technology now. They know how to store the energy from solar collectors in the form of different. There's a variety of techniques that are being implemented out in California right now. He pointed out that if you substituted LED lights for all the lights in the U.S., you decrease the electrical usage by 19%, which is how much electricity the nuclear power plants produce. So, I mean, there's solutions. It's just a question of, do the vested interests want to implement them?
Last quick question. Are you just kind of rolling with it and just see if the criticality escalates a little bit as far as our personal health is concerned, or have you taken any steps to, protect yourself? I mean, do you keep potassium iodide around, or what do you do?
Well, I live about 23 miles away from the Callaway reactor, and so I try to be aware of that just because, if you look at the history of reactor accidents, they don't always tell you what's going on.
No.
So I think it's prudent to, what we really need in this country is to get citizens to get their own rad alerts and some of the different things and keep track of it themselves and form a network. If you look at the so-called robust line of defense that we have here with our nuclear detection system in the U.S., it's a joke. They have point source monitors that are a couple hundred miles apart, and all they do is they have some fans and stuff that blow on just different screens and filters they collect. But if a cloud of radiation goes 100 feet over it or 100 feet on either side, it won't detect it. So, that's not a. I don't. You have to get people that are really interested in this that will check every day and give honest reports.
Well, I have a feeling more people are interested in it after these 4 hours than were before. Stephen, we're out of show. We got to go. But thank you for coming on the program. Let's stay in touch, and we'll get back together on the air soon. All right.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye.
Well, thanks to our guest tonight, Arnie Gunderson, fairwinds.org, F-A-I-R-E winds.org. David Bloom, permaculture.com. Come on. There we go. Dr. John Apsley. Dr. John Apsley is at drapsley.com. Just drapsley.com. And Stephen Starr, nucleardarkness.org, psr.org also. It was a pleasure to be in with you tonight. I wish the subject matter had been a little more lighthearted, but what the heck? Sometimes you just got to roll with it. Tomorrow's the second Sunday of the month. Well, today in some parts of the world. So I'll talk to you, when it becomes nighttime again. And we'll discuss the future of the flying car with Dr. Paul Muller. Maybe a couple of surprises there. Thanks for everybody who called. Sorry to anybody we didn't get to. Talk to you tomorrow night. Till then and beyond. Good night and be well.